Hello, folks. I can see people are starting to stream into today's webinar. So I want to welcome you, those who have joined us, and we'll anticipate more people joining us as we go. But seeing that it is 1 o'clock, I want to keep us on a nice schedule and keep moving along. And now getting feedback from YouTube, which is a nice reminder that we're also streaming to YouTube, and we're recording the presentation that'll be archived as well on the CDRPC website. For those of us who are unfamiliar with the organization, CDRPC is a regional planning commission. We work in Albany, Schenectady, Saratoga, and Rensselaer County on issues that go beyond municipal borders. So that may involve criminal justice, economic development, stormwater planning, sustainability, and economic development. A whole host of issues that we kind of work to function and get municipalities to work better, smarter, and to save money and deliver better services to you, the taxpayers. I do want to remind people that today's session has been submitted to the American Planning Association for a CM credit. For those of you who are joining us for your 4 hours of credits for planning and zoning boards, you will receive a confirmation after the end of the webinar directly from Zoom confirming your attendance. If you don't get this, please email us at CDRPC, and I'll give you the email address. That's cdrpc@cdrpc.org. Just let us know if you need some information about how to access the webinar or today's materials. Our attendees join us with video off and muted, and that's so we don't get any disruptions. But we do want you to still interact with us. So what I'm really strongly encouraging folks to do is to punch your questions into the chat, or use the Q&A function. What I will do is I'll function like a radio DJ, if you will, and I'll try to interject with our presenters where there's an opportune time and be able to coordinate with them to get your questions answered. But please use that chat function or use that Q&A, and I can manage to relay questions when it's appropriate. All right, now that housekeeping is out of the way, I got a really exciting session today, solar from an industry perspective. Joining us today, and I'm really sorry if I butcher your names, guys. Loren Pruskowski, did I do that right? With Ecolegacy Values, and David Byrne with Renua Energy. And today's session, we're going to be hearing from the industry itself and some of the challenges and some of the success stories that have taken place throughout our presenters' experience. Essentially, we want to know how solar projects come together. What makes the site attractive for solar? What are some common hurdles and development considerations that exist from the developer's perspective? What initiatives could a community develop to make social development more attractive or more streamlined, or be able to respond to some of the comments and concerns that community's members raised earlier on, so we create a good dialogue? And I won't say a fast track to permitting, but a way to communicate projects better, so we're not stuck in this perhaps a churn of being able to determine some of the impacts or some of the changes that could happen during the site plan process to a solar development, so that everyone understands the regulatory process and the possibilities moving forward through that process. So I'm really excited to welcome Loren and Dave, and I really appreciate you guys for joining us today, giving us an hour of your time. I know you two are very busy, but I wanted to turn over to you two, and thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you.
You both are muted. I think, Loren, you're muted. So,
thank you. Awesome. Can you all see me as well?
I can see you. Yeah. So we are broadcasting you, and I held up the screen share a little bit long, but we're going.
So hi, I am Loren Pruskowski of Ecolegacy Values. I have been developing or consulting to the development of renewable energy projects for over 20 years now, which is kind of amazing to say. I am going to keep this presentation pretty informal. I'm just going to speak out loud to you about some of the subjects that Martin talked about, and I really want to encourage you to engage and to ask any question you want, possibly. And if I'm saying something that doesn't make sense, and you need me to clarify or change my language, please let me know. I'll do my best to change my language. If it still doesn't stick, let me know. Dave will also be able to assist. And between the two of us and with Martin, I think we should be able to answer most of your questions. And if we can't, I promise you that I will put them in my memory bank and I will answer them at future presentations. So I apologize if I say anything inaccurately. Dave, if you do hear me make any mistakes, please feel free to correct me. My ego is not that big, and I do make mistakes. Today, we're going to talk about the solar development process, really what makes a good site. That's going to be the majority of it. And then we're going to talk about the things that you're going to see more of in the future, such as agrivoltaics and community ownership of these renewable energy assets. So I'm going to teach you how to prospect sites so that if you want to own these projects yourselves, you can do so. All right. So what makes a good site? Well, there's a couple different components. Essentially, we want to find a site that has a land parcel that's large enough to host our desired project size, close enough to viably interconnect to three-phase electrical lines that have the capacity to hold that power, on parcels that are perceived to have public support for a project, or at least not a large amount of public resistance, in a jurisdiction where there is a pathway to acquire permits, or there will be visibility soon for a pathway to acquire permits. So I'm just going to make a quick distinction between large-scale solar and distributed generation. Large-scale solar essentially interconnects to utility scale transmission lines. Those transmission lines are the ones that you see that, next to 90, that are 100, 200 feet above the air. They're high voltage lines, and they transmit power hundreds of miles to substations, which then change the voltage to lower voltage lines that feed distribution lines. And the distribution lines are those lines that feed your home or your business. So when I say distributed generation, I'm talking about projects that interconnect to the distribution lines or on-site power, but really I'm talking about the distribution lines, connection to distribution lines. If you have questions about utility scale projects, we'll do our best to answer them, but that's really not my strong suit. And I just want to distinguish that right from the get-go. So when looking at...
Yep. Sorry, just to jump in,
yes, please.
To maybe give a frame of reference here. So distributed generation, i.e. community solar projects, which you see a lot across New York State, usually comprise of about 20 to 30 acres, let's call it. The utility scale projects that Loren is alluding to, that requires the construction of a substation dedicated to that solar asset. And usually the minimum acreage that you'll see in play for those projects is about 120 acres plus. And, at the municipal level, you'll see more of the distributed generation or the community solar projects in front of you, as opposed to larger scale utility scale projects.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
And with regards to project size, there's kind of a rule of thumb that I use, and this is just a loose rule of thumb, but 4 to 5 acres per megawatt it seems to be about appropriate. So that means if you're looking for a 25 megawatt project, you probably want about 25 acres. If you're looking for a 1 acre project, you're going to want more like 5, possibly a little more, depending on the land profile and the setbacks and the local bylaws pertaining to solar in your area. So essentially, you want, when you're doing the prospecting work, you want to find those parcels that are close to 3-phase. And when I say close to 3-phase, I mean within 3/4 of a mile for about a 5 megawatt project. If you're going smaller than that, you're going to want to be closer to that distribution line. It costs a lot of money to run 3-phase from the 3-phase circuit to the project, and it's about $500,000 per mile. So you want, the closer you can get to that line, the better. And also you want to make sure that there's capacity, meaning that there's thermal capacity to absorb the energy from your project. And so there are maps provided by the utility companies. And we, if you're interested, we could post this in the chat later, a website to see these. But essentially, you could see a map of the distribution system and its capacity to handle, its estimated capacity to handle more power. So if you find a parcel close to three-phase and you believe that there's not going to be a tremendous amount of resistance, or even better, you believe there's going to be support for a project, and you see that there is a pathway to permits, meaning that there are bylaws that are favorable to solar, or there's projects that have been built in that area, so there's precedent set, then you approach the landowner and you come into agreement with the landowner to essentially host a project or evaluate the ability to host a project. And once you have that land secured, then you go and you deal with the local utility company and you go through the CESAR process, which is really just an electrical impact review. It's a statewide standardized review process that each utility company goes through. And what they're going to do is they're going to verify that there is indeed capacity for that line, and they're going to tell you what the upgrade costs are. Meaning, if you have a 5 megawatt project, they're going to say you can put 5 megawatts on, and this is what it costs in electrical upgrades to safely put electrons from your project onto the grid. And as a developer, you're going to need, in order to secure the rights to stay in the queue, you're going to need to be able to put down some money to the utility company well before project construction. So there are payments to the utility company way before the project technically becomes financeable. But once you get the green light from the utility company, then you go into the public permitting realm and you deal with the local planning board and zoning board to deal with these projects. So that's essentially the process to go from the concept of a project to in front of the planning board or in front of the zoning board. And are there any questions about that? Or Dave, is there anything else you'd like to add about that process, distinctions, clarifications, value that you might be able to perceive that these people could gain?
The only thing I would add, Loren, is that you want to look at wetlands and environmental studies early on in the process. So as you described, you know, one of the most critical gateways to pass through is the utility interconnection study, even just getting preliminary results. And then, you know, if those look favorable, you'd want to invest in studies in the wetlands, at least preliminarily. You can do a lot of that via desktop reviews based upon the various tools that are available to us. And you want to make sure that based on the available space and any existing wetlands, that you're going to have a viable project in terms of economies of scale. And, you know, obviously you have to differentiate between DEC wetlands and Army Corps and understanding the buffer implications for DEC, et cetera. So in New York State, that's a real thing. And a lot of times it does kill projects or severely restricts it to the point of not being financially viable later on down the road when folks are looking for investors. So that's an important consideration.
One thing I did put in the chat, if folks are curious about mapped wetlands on a state scale, certainly your municipality is going to have better on the ground data as far as environmental constraints of projects, be it wetlands or steep slopes or other limiting environmental factors. But New York State has an environmental mapper and they do feature wetlands on there. Not as going to be good as ground truthing your site, but it is one area where you as a interested party in the solar development process, or a planning board member, or somebody who might be on your conservation council may be able to use to gather more information about a site and what potential issues there may be. So I'll post that link in the chat.
Okay. And I'm just going to talk a little bit, I think we have enough time, just about some of the challenges that can happen in this process. Moratoriums are starting to pop up in the solar realm. And I have a lot more experience. Dave has some experience with moratoriums right now in New York State. And I have a lot more experience with moratoriums with regards to wind development. In the space of 2005 to 2007, pretty much every town that I went into within New York State and pretty much without New York State, once we got to the point of permitting a project, there was a timeout because people didn't know how to handle these projects. And, you know, one of the reasons why there's timeout is because the projects that we were developing at the time were on-site projects to be owned by some sort of local entity, whether it be a municipality, a school, or a business, or a homeowner in that region. And so for the most part, people were supportive of the fact that most of the benefits were going to the local community. However, there were large-scale projects being developed simultaneously, and people were reacting in great fear to these large projects for many different reasons. And I'm going to generalize, and I apologize if I get some of these generalizations wrong, but I'm just going to tell you some of the experiences that I saw, and potentially some ways to avoid this level of mistrust or distrust that can happen between a developer and a local community. So there were a couple projects or communities that I went into where developers were securing land leases with landowners and multiple landowners. So they're getting a contiguous group of landowners together, and then they're bringing the project to obtain local permits. They're bringing it in front of the town board, the planning board, and in theory that would be really quick. You could do this really quickly, but in reality, the gap between when they were first approaching landowners and when they were going into the public domain was almost 2 years. And so sometimes these landowners were advised not to talk to the community members. Other times they chose not to. But what happened was their neighbors and community members were first learning about the project 2 years after landowners were being approached. And a lot of people felt like, whoa, what's going on here? You know, you've been in my backyard for 2 years. Why haven't I heard anything from you? And this created a level of distrust. And a lot of times these projects were sited in areas that were very sensitive. And so there was a lot of pushback from the community in order to create laws that were favorable to these projects. And I think that in some ways moratoriums can be a good thing, although it adds a lot of cost to a project and a lot of uncertainty and risk to the developer. And there are some ways that you could help mitigate some of these risks. And one is actually talking to your neighbors and asking them, telling them why you are supportive of this project, sharing your mind and asking them for feedback. Like, what are their concerns? You know, what are their fears? And trying to address them early in the development process as opposed to later on. What people don't know they fear. And when people are fearful, they make bad decisions. I mean, that's just the reality. It's the culprit of good decision making is fear and anger. And decisions create our destiny. So we want to make the best decisions possible. And to reduce that fear, you want to talk to your neighbors and really approach them with open-mindedness and transparency about what you're doing. And then if they share fears, work to address them. Try to find ways, if you can, to change those fears. And so that's one method you can utilize in order to kind of reduce the friction in the development process. There will always be some friction. And then if you can choose sites that have less visibility or less sensitivity to community, that's also a good thing. There was a project that was being permitted, I think in 2019 in Gilderland. It was on the local escarpment on the west side of town. And the west side's very rural. The east side is very dense. A lot of people in the town identified with the escarpment as a natural landscape feature that they really like. And so there were about 2,000 people signing a petition against the siting of this project. Thankfully, the stakeholders involved did a really good job of coming to the table and working through these issues. You know, the town put a very quick moratorium on it within the town. I think it was maybe a 2 or 3 month moratorium. And the developer, the landowner, and the town all worked together to come up with a solution, which was to move the project, I don't know, a couple thousand feet away to a less visible site. And so that project is, I don't know if it's constructed right now. I'm pretty sure it is. I know it was set up for construction, but that's a good success story where a timeout wasn't necessarily a bad thing, but all the community stakeholders came together to find an agreeable solution. And that's always a good thing.
If I could, Loren, I had a question in the chat, and I'm going to try to generalize the question because I think they're speaking to your practices, but I think it's more helpful to focus on, in the circumstance, the market itself. And the question was, do you try to avoid establishing projects on active farmland and prime farmland soils? So I guess to restructure that, what's the relationship between development and active farms, soil preservation? I know it's a big question, but I wondered if you had some insight from your perspective on that.
That is a wonderful transition. Actually, that was going to be the next thing I was talking about, which is, you know, I don't know if you remember the Bush era, George W., when essentially corn it stopped going into the ag markets, or a lot of it stopped going into the ag markets and went into the energy production markets as far as ethanol. And I remember at that point in time, the arguments that, you know, you're robbing Peter to pay Paul. And I got to be honest, I agreed. I mean, when that was happening, I questioned the validity of that decision making, and whether it was really helpful to the community or not. So with regards to solar, I don't think it's as black and white. You know, I don't think you have to trade energy production or trade farming for energy production, or vice versa. You can do both together. And so project that Dave's helping me on in Guilderland, where Ecolegacy Values is developing an 8 megawatt project, and we're designing it so that we will use sheep to maintain the vegetation in between the solar panels. So we give the sheep food, and we receive vegetation maintenance as a result. This is a way that we can keep farming in and around these panels. And I think this is a really powerful option. And I think you're going to see a lot more of it. And so I was going to bring this up today. Anyhow, right now we are in the process of, you know, talking to sheep farmers and to enter a contract with them. And just to give you a little bit of a summarization of some of the contract stipulations, essentially the sheep farmer would be responsible for transporting the sheep from wherever they stay in the winter to the site in the summer, and they will stay there all growing season. The sheep farmer will be responsible for the care of the sheep, and will also be responsible to make sure that the vegetation doesn't get above 28 inches or the bottom of the solar panels. And if the sheep weren't there, we'd be using some sort of lawnmower to basically just mow down this grass that could be used for sheep. And as a result of the sheep being there, there are so many benefits to the biodiversity of the land. And, you know, you're going to get more topsoil, and, you know, you're going to support really clean sheep. And I think this is a win-win situation. And I believe that this is a very viable business model. And I know in other domains outside of New York, they're looking at other ways to basically have dual use of the land, meaning for farming and for solar.
In that example you brought up about the sheep, was that a requirement imposed by Guildland or a consideration of the development process, or is that something that you brought to the table as a consideration of the project?
That was something. So this is a very unique project where my family we are the landowners. So we have the perspective of being a landowner, a community member, and a developer all at the same time. And so as good stewards of the land, it just made sense to do this. So this is something we brought to the project, and we're really excited to see where this goes.
And then I got one more question as it relates to farming, but I reserve my right to jump in for more. Okay. We had a question about environmental impact on farmland used for solar panels that might be returned to farming later. So I think this gets into decommissioning. Perhaps now or perhaps later when we start talking about decommissioning, are there elements of a solar project where there's a decommissioning plan that involves a return to its prior use? Are there any projects that you're aware of that have been decommissioned to return to a farm? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Hey, Loren, I can take this if.
Thanks, Dave.
So just to back up, in New York State, there's Ag and Markets, which provides guidelines for siting solar on farmland. So they play a very active role in review of all projects that are sited on active prime farmland. And they have certain guidelines. There's a document that's, I think, 12 pages long, give or take. And that spells out for us, when we're looking at the construction phase of the project, all the practices that need to be adopted in order to ensure that this land can be returned to viable farming after it's been decommissioned. And decommissioning is just a fancy way of explaining, how this land will be returned back to its current or its original condition. And we try to avoid farmland when possible. But as Loren alluded to, there's many other constraints. And I'll touch more on that, I think, a little bit later if it's relevant. But it's very tough to find a good solar property. In fact, when you look at the success rate, usually you're about 1% success rate in terms of all the properties that you initially reach out to and think that might be viable for solar that actually end up moving forward. And so the point is that sometimes we do put solar on farmland, but we abide by the Ag and Markets guidelines. We file a notice of intent, so all the state agencies are aware. But most importantly, we design the project such that we're not removing any topsoils from the site. We stockpile it on site. A lot of the construction is, in terms of the racking, is pile driven in nature. So you're not necessarily using screws, or you're not putting concrete foundations or piers in the ground unless you absolutely need to. And that's very, very rare. I mean, it's very expensive and almost cost prohibitive to take that approach. So typically you're driving piles in the ground. And then when you're decommissioning the system, you're pulling those back out. There is an access road that we have to box out, and we bring gravel in for that. So in order to box that out, we do stockpile the soils on site. There's an equipment pad or two as well, and sometimes that requires stockpiling. But the point is, from a long-term agricultural standpoint, frankly speaking, and many people have different opinions on this, but I think the science is pretty clear that when you turn over the soils, every year when you're farming, farmers do that as a common practice, but also when you're doing that every single year without allowing the soils to rest, when those soils are turned over and exposed to sunlight and the elements, a lot of the beneficial microbes in those soils, which allow for, really nutritious cash crops to be grown there, some of those are depleted. And so what we're doing with a 25 to 30 year term lease is we're allowing these soils to rest and recuperate so that after the system life is complete, it can be returned back to farming. And that's always our intent, is to design and construct these projects such that they can be reverted back to farming, because obviously that's important as well.
So I got a great transition question here, and you brought up the leases, and I'm just going to read this question because it ties in so well. Do you anticipate renewals of solar leases on farmland rather than decommissioning? And once a land lease is secured and investments and distribution connections are made, it would seem likely to continue on the sites to adjust to new technology. Do you have thoughts about the longevity or survivability of projects beyond the terms of their leases?
It's a great question. And Dave, please share your thoughts after I'm done with mine. I think as long as it's economically viable to essentially extend the life of the solar farm as much as reasonably possible, it's going to be done. So much infrastructure is already in place that a lot of the industry is hoping or anticipating that the panels will be up for more than 25 years, or that the racking will host a new generation of panels. And so the way the leases are structured right now, or at least the way that our lease is structured, it's a 25-year lease with an option for 4 5-year extensions. And after that, I don't know. Assuming that the grid is still around and that people will still need electricity, I think that, which I think those are safe assumptions. I know that people are going to need electricity, but the grid being around, there are people who
I'm going to cross my fingers. Yeah.
Yeah. There are people that really don't think that the grid's going to be around. So if we're around as a human race and we're going to need electricity, whether that comes from the grid or not, who knows? I'm guessing that it will be coming from the grid because it takes so much effort to go off grid. However, that might change. But after 45 years, where we stand, I don't know. I could imagine that if people are used to a production facility in that area, they would be more willing to support another generation of that, as long as it was a healthy project that benefited the landowner and the community.
Aside from the grazing example that you brought up, are there other types of agricultural uses that could still take place and prevent the portion or all of that parcel from taken out of agricultural use?
That's a great question. So as far as the grazing goes, I think that the sheep are the best. We looked into goats and possibly even cows. And after doing a little research, I don't know if you've ever hung around with any goats, but they like to
climb and gnaw.
And they like to climb. Exactly. They will go to the highest point. And so they would ultimately end up trying to get on top of these units. And so we nixnayed the goats, and the sheep made a lot of sense because they're not going to law on the electrical wires behind. As far as growing crops, I know that there are some universities. I don't know if Cornell is one of them, but there's a university in North Carolina, I think it's North Carolina State, that's doing a lot of research on the agrivoltaic side. And they're trying to grow some vegetables that actually want less light directly underneath the panels. And so there's a lot of research going on, meaning like broccoli or something that wants less light. I don't know what the result of that information is. Right now, I don't see any other viable option. I think that this will happen in phases, meaning that right now there will be solar grazing, and if there is advancements in the industry, or there are advancements from people that are working tangentially with the industry or kind of cross-pollinating ideas with the industry, that there will be developers and owners that will try out these kind of new ideas to see if they're viable and to figure out ways to make them more viable. So, yeah.
I'll just add that there's a lot of consultants out there who will come in and based on the geography of the proposed area, they'll come up with a plan to have fruit trees and other types of productive trees on site as well. Obviously, they can't grow too high because that's going to impose shading on the array. But we've worked on some projects where there was a full integration of various types of trees and smaller shrubs as well that we're generating additional revenue through agriculture for the property owner.
Yeah, I know a gentleman in Gilderland who's interested in seeing more proliferation of pollinator species as a ground cover, because beekeeping is an agricultural practice that can be employed without any disruption on a solar operation. So
yeah, we do that on all our projects. Actually, we specify a pollinator friendly mix.
mm-hmm.
And I haven't talked to any beekeepers yet, but it's that's still on the table.
If we could, maybe I'll interject with a couple questions of mine while you guys gather your thoughts. If you've got a next chapter or so of the presentation, I wondered when we talk about going through the development review process, that's where communication can oftentimes result in some heated conversations as things are moving forward, or some difficulty in understanding a project's metes and bounds. Could you talk about, perhaps from your perspective, some typical myths about the development process, or some of the situations where there may not be as simple as a give and take when scoping a project for things like stormwater management, or plantings, or access, or shielding a site, those sorts of elements?
Yeah, Dave, I imagine you have a lot of experience with this, but I can bring up one that I've heard in the solar domain, and I've heard a lot of in the wind domain. And that's that these projects cause cancer. And people will come in front of the town and talk to a large group of people, and they will be highly emotional, and they will talk about how someone in their community, or someone that they heard about in a community that hosts a project, that their child developed cancer. And it is a challenge, as a developer, of how to sensitively acknowledge the pain that someone's feeling and try to redirect it back towards facts. I have never ever seen any sort of study that shows that there's causality between solar or wind and cancer. There's the type of radiation that's coming from these panels is ionizing, which typically is not dangerous. It's what we have in cell phones. It's not like X-ray technology, which does show a likelihood of developing cancer if there's too much exposure. And so that one's something I've heard of. It's a myth. Typically when it comes up, it's in a public setting, and there's so much fear in who's sharing it that other people that don't know anything about these projects, they can resonate with the fear, and it can grow, and that can be problematic. And it's, like I said, it's a challenge to be sensitive to a human being and also try to stick with the facts. Dave, do you have any experiences you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, Loren, to your comment that, there's studies out there that show that once you're set back from the fence line, because all these arrays are fenced in, and you're looking at EMF, you have to look at two things. You look at the electric field, and then you look at the magnetic field. And when you look at the electric field, if you're about 50 feet back from the fence line, you're going to be less than 5 volts per meter. And there's an International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and they've stated that as long as you're below 4,200 volts per meter, that's considered to be safe for the general public. So obviously very minuscule in comparison to that standard. And then also on the magnetic field side, we're coming in at 0.2 to 0.4 mg, whereas that same commission had defined 833 mg as being safe for the general public. So even if we err on the side of being conservative and saying that it is a newer technology, and it's good to understand cost benefit that are in play for every project. Even if you say, okay, even 833 on the magnetic side may be too high, you want to be at let's say 100, you're still only at 0.2 to 0.4. So again, a lot of misunderstandings regarding EMF. We're having to step up the voltage from our projects to be able to interconnect to the grid. And so, if you're living along three-phase power, you're dealing with 13.2 kV or 12.8 kV, depending on the utility and the region. And, we're having to step up from 1500 volts to, 13 kV with our transformers. So a lot of people think that this is very high voltage or, very strong in terms of magnetic field, and it's just not. There's protections in play, and also this technology itself is just at lower voltage. So I wanted to clarify that. And then, touching on Loren's comment previously regarding fear and moratoriums, there's a huge misunderstanding in our communities that solar is going to pop up everywhere. And based upon people's perception, they may see, 2 to 3 solar projects in their town, and they're like, well, there's no built-in protections to prevent this from happening everywhere on every square foot of available space across the town. And this goes back to what Loren explained earlier about siting solar projects and the limitations built into the grid. So not only do you need three-phase power in close proximity, every three-phase power line can only support on average 2 projects at the DG level. And you have to be wherever you tie into the grid within about 5 miles of the substation itself. And then you have to look at the transformer bank capacity of the substation. And it's a lot to consider, but when you evaluate it all, what we've seen is on average, most towns can support somewhere between 3 to 5 projects, probably on average, about 4 to 4.5 projects. And it's really important for town leadership teams to understand this, because there is a fear out there that solar will pop up everywhere, and no one wants that either. There's a good way to develop solar and there's a bad way. And Loren's one of the good guys developing solar in a good way that's sensitive to the surrounding community and trying to minimize impact and practice empathy in his approach to developing the project. And the point is, we want to develop good projects on in good areas and avoid the bad projects. And I think if towns can be open to that and understanding that there's a lot of self-limiting factors built into the grid infrastructure, they'll understand that it's not going to pop up everywhere. And through zoning that's reasonable and through community engagement, we can find those good projects together.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit about kind of navigating that process when it comes to community elements like screening, setbacks, reviewing a project and its visual impacts to a community?
Sure, Loren, I'll just answer this briefly. So we always implement screening whenever it's feasible and whenever the town requires it and or the community requests it. It's important to manage expectations though, because if you take trees and you dig them out of the ground and then you transport them and plant them on a new site as part of a screening plan, it's important to keep in mind that the larger the tree is when you transport it and transplant it, the more slowly it's going to grow. So usually we like to come in with a height of about 5 feet on trees, and we like to do a mixture of deciduous and evergreens to make it seem more organic in nature. And we go with a smaller tree initially so that it'll grow more quickly, because the net benefit in terms of screening is much greater if you go with a smaller tree initially. So we always try to be transparent with neighbors and community members to help them to understand that, yes, initially there'll be less of a visual mitigation based on the tree height, but over time that will become more significant. And if we're not packing the trees in too tightly via our landscaping plan, it's also going to be more sustainable in terms of effective screening over time. There's many ways to look at visual impacts. And, sometimes what we do is we'll go out in the field and we'll hold a bright pink panel up. We'll use bright pink poster board on an extension pole, and we'll put it at the anticipated height at the very top of the array. And then we'll look from different vantage points. And actually, sometimes we'll meet with property owners and they'll say, well, I'm really concerned about the visual impact from my bedroom, for example, and we'll take our shoes off at the door and go up into their bedroom and take photos and try to see, if they can see that bright pink panel out in the field, because obviously that's easier to see than black panels. So that's one way that we do visual impacts, and we have that height set by that extension pole in the field, and then we can superimpose the array on that and provide that as a visual aid. There's other ways also where we work with graphic designers who have the ability to capture different vantage points. And what we like to do, frankly, is we like to walk out, into the community with stakeholders, meaning municipal board members as well as local property owners, and look at it from their property, so we understand their concerns and we can address it effectively. Because sometimes people do a generic visual impact study and it doesn't have as much credibility, because people's criticism is, anyone can just graphically design this, and it's not necessarily relevant or accurate. And we like to take photos from the field.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We get a question about the infrastructure that comes along with development of these facilities, and I'm just going to read the question so I get this right. Is the cost for upgrades to distribution lines and substations, those elements, all on the developer, or are utilities investing in upgrading these types of facilities and siting substations? And are those costs being shared? How does the proliferation of that type of infrastructure get funded and be advanced? And what is the developer's responsibility in that process?
Okay.
Complex question.
Well, the responsibility is really on whoever's developing the project. That cost is, it can be shared amongst other private developers. If you basically have two projects on the same line, you can share some of those costs. But the utility company they're not paying for that. You're paying for their time, you're paying for their equipment. The funding comes from a whole assortment. I mean, it's developers get their funding from private investors or their own money. But it's not like there's grants out there to make this happen. I don't know if that helps answer your question, or Dave, if you have anything else to add there.
Yeah, that's right on. People or investors and developers can pool resources and invest in upgrades on both the three-phase power lines, extending the power lines. At the substations themselves, there's what's called a 3VO protection, which is quite common in terms of an upgrade cost, and that those costs are all borne by the developers. And in certain cases, they have the ability to combine their assets and invest jointly in those upgrades.
I'm going to put this into the chat in regards to that question. There is a program through NYSERDA, which is the New York State. Oh my God, I'm going to mess this up, and we work with them all the time. The New York State Energy Research Development Authority. I'm in sewers and stormwaters. The sustainability side of the office would kill me. But there's a program called the Build Ready program, where they work with municipalities throughout the state to identify opportunities where there is expanded need or development pressure, and works with municipalities to invest in facilities like three-phase lines and substations. So if folks are interested about that program through the authority, I will paste a link to that program in the chat so folks can see it.
Please. Yeah. I would love to see that.
And while I'm talking about links and chats, Loren, a couple people asked if you would post that link to the feasibility map, I guess, for lack of better terms, for three-phase line or suitability for infrastructure tie-ins.
Yeah, it's a little confusing because it's hidden in my it's hidden on my iPad, so I would have to dig it out. But I could tell you where it's at. It's jointutilietiesofnewyork.org.
Okay.
And it's utility. Geez, if you write hosting capacity New York State electrical grid, it comes up to joint utilities, and that'll show every utility company has their own map, And so I think everyone's in National Grid territory that's attending this, but just in case they're not, if you go to the Joint Utilities website, you're going to see all of the hosting maps.
Okay. I'm just going to post a link to the site itself instead of the maps.
Thank you.
I'll try to find the link as well.
Thank you.
I apologize. I thought it would be easier to.
That's the beauty of Google. You type in all the words you're thinking of, you punch them in there, and it's gonna point you in the right direction. So, I appreciate that. So I guess I'll ask one more, and then we're tight for time. So I'll say to folks, if you have questions or comments, please get them in the Q&A and chat now. From both of your perspectives, are there, and again, we're talking to the industry perspective, so we got to keep that in balance here. Are there communities, examples of community rules and regulations that you feel are well articulated to be able to balance the needs of the industry and the needs of the residents in a community, so that the rules are well articulated and there seems to be a good communication between those elements and communities? And can you talk a little bit about what sort of rules and regulations and process have you seen throughout New York State that tends to work for communities that are looking to communicate better with stakeholders and responding to solar development?
So I'm going to go real quick on this one. Dave, please feel free to interject, because you have a lot more experience, especially with regards to solar. But the process of developing bylaws is one, where there's a template, there's a draft, and then it's up to the town officials to share that with the community and to gain community input, and then to take that community input and redraft the laws. And so every community does that a little differently. I have seen communities do that extremely efficiently. And I think that more has to do with the people in place than anything. And I've seen communities do that very, very poorly. And I'm not going to point anybody out, because that would just be mean.
Generally.
but there's just a lack of communication skills. And so people aren't transparent. They're not taking ownership of the responsibility of their level of communication, meaning they're not sharing the information, and they're not sharing it in a way where they're taking responsibility of the receiver's emotions and then redirecting it in a way that might be the true intent of the message. I don't know if that makes sense or not.
No, and I want to articulate, Loren, you're not talking about your project. You've got experience developing solar projects throughout the state. So I want to make sure anybody's like he's having problems with this one project. That's an industry perspective from a large geographic area. So I feel like that's fair.
NYSERDA does have a solar model law for municipalities to adopt, and we've seen 80% of what we believe to be reasonable municipal solar laws are ultimately derived from that model law provided by NYSERDA. And NYSERDA will actually come in and do training or consultations with municipalities as they're developing their solar law, if they have questions or issues with any clauses that are found in the model law. But the model law is pretty comprehensive. It incorporates a lot of considerations so that towns don't have to start from scratch. And it ensures that the developers are doing their due diligence and demonstrating that to all the stakeholders. So, there's a decommissioning plan requirement as part of that, a visual impact study requirement in many cases. But in short, what we've seen work in different variations is that a town has a special use permit and a site plan approval process, respectively. And those allow us to present a project, to get feedback from the stakeholders, whether it be the planning board and or the town board, and all those stakeholders have a say and can dictate conditions on the project. And sometimes a project isn't going to be fully designed, because you may be to what we call an issue for permitting or an issue for pricing set, where you're at 90% civil design, and you still need to do some electrical design work, which it can be 50 pages of
Mhm.
detailed drawings. And so the point is that you're not always at 100% issue for construction level when you're in front of the board for permitting, but there's ways where they can impose conditions and say, okay, we're going to grant you conditional approval, and we're still hammering out a pilot agreement, a payment in lieu of taxes agreement with the developer. And also the developer is waiting on final wetlands approval from the DEC, but that process can take a year. So we're not going to hold up the project because we're understanding that there's different processes that need to move forward in parallel for the project. But we're going to impose that these two conditions be met, that we have a payment in lieu of taxes agreement in place, that we have a decommissioning plan that has been executed by all parties fully, and that we have let's call it 100% drawings or 100% approval from the DEC in hand before we issue the building permit. So there's different phases of the approvals, and we've really appreciated when that reasonable approach has been taken, such that the project can continue to move forward and all the boxes are checked for all the stakeholders.
Thank you. One final question, and then we're gonna close it down. But if you guys want to share any contact information, you're welcome to, or folks can reach out to CDRPC. A question about thoughts on limiting solar on slopes greater than 15% to avoid erosion and sediment issues post development. Are there slope standards that developers just stay away from because it makes a project too complicated or creates issues downstream, and you're looking for a particular slope when you're developing a project? How is that coordinated at the municipal level when looking at erosion and sediment control on a particular facility?
Dave, I'll let you take that one if you don't mind. And I have one more thing I want to say when.
Okay.
If that's okay.
Typically, we try to avoid slopes of 15% or greater. A lot of it also has to do with structural considerations based on wind loading, et cetera, especially for single axis tracker arrays, which have a higher profile. Mm-hmm. There are some racking solutions that allow for up to about 20%. And we're going through that right now, actually, in the Greater Capital District on a project where it's an MS4 community. We're working very closely with the town. We're doing our stormwater pollution prevention plan inspections on a weekly basis, reporting back to the town as the MS4, and they have reviewing authority. And it's actually worked out really well because we have a good working relationship. But the point is that town has interjected and asked for, a modification to erosion sediment control plans based on some of the land clearing that was being done. Mm-hmm. And we've had to dictate that to our contractor. So, whether it's MS4 community or not, we work closely with the authorities having jurisdiction on the stormwater pollution prevention. And so the point is that according to New York State standards, we cannot adversely impact stormwater runoff. Yep. On a given property. We have to have either a neutral or positive effect, not a negative effect. And so we do take that burden very seriously.
Dave, do you see post-construction stormwater management practices on sites, or is there just not that amount of disturbance to necessitate post-construction practice?
We do use stormwater basins and detention basins as needed. But the majority of the measures are during construction because, mm-hmm. as we discussed earlier, we prefer that pollinator mix solution. And once that takes hold and the ground is stabilized, there's not as much need.
Great. Thank you. So I'll leave it to Loren to bring us home and take it away.
Yeah, thanks for everyone for staying around and listening to all of this great stuff. The only other thing I really wanted to put on the radar of town officials, is that there have been some changes in tax law that really incentivize towns to take ownership in projects. Towns can get a direct cash payment equivalent to the ITC, which is the investment tax credit that goes to private investors. You can get the equivalent of that, which is 30% of the project cost. in the form of direct cash payment at the end of year one. And you can also do that if the project is supporting an LMI community or affordable housing, you can get another 20%. These are for projects that are 1 megawatt or less. And I think this is an awesome opportunity for communities to embrace the opportunity to site and own their own projects. They would absolutely need help in between. And it's something that Ecolegacy values. It's a market we want to support, and we're looking at different ways to do that. I am interested in understanding the questions that town officials have in order to embrace that opportunity. So if you know of questions or have questions with regards to that future business model, please send them my way, and it will help me form an adequate business model to help support that market.
Certainly. Thank you. Dave, did you have any parting wisdom before we close up shop?
Thank you all for taking the time. We want to do right by the communities we're working in. And we feel strongly that the right project can have tangible benefits for all the stakeholders. Number one, the property owner who's generating lease revenue, the town, which will benefit from additional revenue as well. Local contractors via job opportunities, both during the construction phase and maintenance phases, the developer, obviously, the environment and future generations. So I think when everyone comes to the table with an open mind, we can make sure that all the stakeholders are winning. And then lastly, you have discounted electricity, which is available to off-takers from these community solar projects.
It's true. Well, I really thank you very much for sharing the past hour of your time. And you're both very busy, and I really do appreciate it. I think it's a great value to our attendees, either to get a mixed perspective on things, not just from the regulatory side, but from the industry side as well. And so I really value your time, and thanks for kicking off the webinar series. I do got to shamelessly plug, and I'm going to share my screen here. I do have to shamelessly plug opportunities coming up for our next planning and zoning webinar series. We'll be back on March 22nd, and we'll have presenters talking to us about the seeker process and recent changes to the seeker process. That's going to be really engaging, so I encourage people to attend that presentation as well. We will archive this presentation, put a video link to YouTube, CDRPC's YouTube channel. So it's the only time I ever get to say like and subscribe. I'm not an influencer or a content creator, but I do get to say that at the end of every webinar, because we do put a link to that on YouTube. And so folks will be able to access this in perpetuity. And so that link will be on CDRPC's website as well. Just look for us in news and events, and look for the planning and zoning series. We'll archive that. Anybody who's joining and looking for your 4 hours of credits, there, I believe there's an email that Zoom sends out confirming your attendance in the webinar series. So look for that to be able to submit to your municipality. And some bittersweet news. Today is actually my last day at CDRPC. I'm leaving to take a position with the City of Albany as Director of Infrastructure Management. So when I go out the door for CDRPC, it's my last full-time day. I'm remaining on part-time to make sure some projects get completed here on my end. So for those of you who are joining us, your moderators will be different from this point forward. I know you're used to seeing my face, so please temper your disappointment and don't send any hate mail our way. But again, thank you to Loren and Dave. I really appreciate the time you took with us and sharing your expertise. If there's anything folks need, please email cdrpc@cdrpc.org, and we can certainly connect you with additional resources as they relate to sustainability and solar. So thank you, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and take care. Bye, gentlemen. Thank you.
Bye.